Well, it's Mother's Day, and I want to talk about the nature of nurture, because that's what mothers do for us. They nurture us, and it's such a valuable thing. And so many times as we live life and as we go about our world, we don't think about the value of being nurtured, how important that is from the time when we're young and even when we're older. And I want to read to you first today from John chapter 19. This is a great verse. I think it helps us recognize that a mother figure for us doesn't have to be our biological mother. I know that for many, Mother's Day is a day of sadness because your mother's passed away. Maybe you never really had a mother, a biological mother. And so for us, the term mother can mean different things. I mean, for someone like me, I rejoice on Mother's Day. My mother's still alive. My wife, who's my children's mother, is alive and well. And so for me, it's a day of rejoicing. But I know that that's not the case for many of us. And for some of us, our mothers abused us or hurt us in some way. We've never recovered for that. And so it can be a difficult holiday. And I think this verse here helps us discover the value, though, of that woman, that person in our life that has nurtured us. Whether it was a biological mother or not. Maybe it was an adopted mother. Maybe it was a grandmother. Maybe it was just a woman role model in your life that nurtured you when you needed that. When we say that term today, and we say the word mother, that's who we're talking about. And in John chapter 19, verse 26 and 27, this is when Jesus recognized the value of his mother and that he was going to be going, and from the physical sense, away. And he asked John to become the caretaker of his mother. When Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to his mother, "Woman, behold your son." And then he said to the disciple, "Behold your mother." And from that hour the disciple took her to his own home. And so we see that it's not necessarily a biological mother that we have to have, although it's a blessing when we have that, for sure, in order to have that person in our life, that person that mothers us, that nurtures us, and takes care of us. And I want to begin this morning by talking about Mary, the mother of Jesus. You know, she was a very interesting character in the New Testament, and she plays a vital role. I know that traditionally believers have been somewhat of a patriarchal culture, and so I think that even if you hold to that view, you can't deny the value of the mother of Jesus and her role. First of all, we see that in the New Testament she acts as a disciple in many places, and not to be confused with the 12 apostles. All right, she was never called to be an apostle, but she certainly was a follower of Jesus. So she was a disciple. She constantly was a visible figure that people saw, following Jesus, leading others. A lot of our church tradition pictures Mary as someone that mentored other young women and was even a mentor to Mary Magdalene and others. And we see them interact in a few places in the Gospels. And so Mary is a character that we see a lot. We see the narrative of the birth narrative. We see narratives of her in the temple when Jesus was around 12 years old, and her seeking him when he was lost in the temple, when he was teaching in the temple. And so we have a lot of places where we see these pictures, or it's almost kind of like if you take videos of things in your life or of your kids, you see these little video clips, all right, of things that happen. And that's kind of what we have in the Scriptures. We have these little clips of time. And we have to kind of fill in the gaps on our own to understand who this person was. One of the things that I think is really interesting to me about Mary, the mother of Jesus, is that she stayed by Jesus when almost everyone else ran. Remember when he had been taken before Pontius Pilate, before Herod. He had been beaten, and the disciples began to disperse. And all the people that were so faithful before, they were nowhere to be found, but yet she was there. She followed him to Golgotha. She was there on Resurrection Day when the tomb was rolled from the grave. She was constantly there. She was consistently there. And I think that is a great model for us, for women in mothers, is to always be there. That's one of the most valuable things that you can do, mothers, is just to simply be there, to be present. for your children or for those that you are nurturing is so important. And we see that in the life of Mary. Also, we see that Mary was strength and stability in a world where there was chaos and uncertainty. Now, we all like to hear that phrase, the calm in a storm. We recognize the value of that. We recognize how peaceful that is, to have calm in the midst of the storm. I think we're all very fascinated with hurricanes and tornadoes, about how there's that eye inside where it's calm for just a moment. In the midst of all the swirling and the chaos and the debris and the energy that's being released, there's that peacefulness, there's that calm. And that's the effect that nurturing can have on us, is that it protects us. It brings us to a place of calm even in the midst of the craziness of life. And so those are certainly characteristics, all three of those things, that we see from her. So let's talk more about some of those things and how exactly mothers nurture. Because I think regardless of whether you're here today and you are a mom, or maybe perhaps you are one that is receiving that nurturing, or is maybe in between those two places, maybe you're older, you've been a mom, your children are raised, your parents have gone on. I think all of us fall into different categories. So it's hard for us to really take one position and identify with that. But I think certainly all of us in our life have those figures in our life that nurture us, or we are in that place in our life where we are being that nurturing person. And so I think these apply to all of us regardless of where we are. First of all, a mother that nurtures well is sensitive to the needs of her children. Sensitive. So when you're sensitive, that means that you're listening, right? You're looking for clues. You're looking beyond what is stated. You're looking beyond the superficial or the surface evidence in someone's life, and you see beyond that. You see the deep need that's there. And that's important as we nurture people in our life, that we're sensitive to those needs. Because in a large sense, when you're an infant, you rely 95% on your mother. You have no one else to take care of you and provide for you in that unique way that only a mother can. And so you're very vulnerable at that time. And so you have a need for that mother to nurture you. And we all have that need. And oftentimes in life when we are deprived of that, it causes emotional damage. And we struggle to get through those things because we have that deep need of having someone that is looking after us, that's thinking about us, thinking about what it is that we need. And that's important to us. And I found that even for adult women, that is a deep inner need that they have from their spouse and from other people in their life, is that need to be understood. That need, almost, if we're going to say it sarcastically, maybe to have someone read your mind, and know what you need. Sometimes I think my wife wants me to read her mind, and I wish I could, and I try so hard all the time and don't do it very well. But they have that need for that to happen, for people to be sensitive with them. And that's something that has to be modeled for us and demonstrated for us so that we can meet that need in other people. A second thing that is important for one that nurtures is to be patient with childishness. And what do I mean by childishness? Well, I think there are two types of misbehavior. As a parent of 5 children, teenager age, kind of pre-teenager age, child age, toddler age, all those different ages, there seems to be, from my perspective, 2 types of misbehavior. There is childishness, which that's whenever your 5-year-old reaches for something and they knock the glass over and the liquid spills all over the table, which this is a common act at our home. At least 3 times a week, someone will knock their glass over and the ice will go flying. And of course, we used to have our dogs now. We don't let them run around when we're eating upstairs, but used to, they just are waiting, for that perfect moment when someone's going to drop food or someone's going to spill something, and they'd be on it like that, just bam, they're on it. But those acts of things where there's not harm intended, it was just irresponsible because they're young and they do things like that as they're learning to become responsible. But then there is rebellion type of behavior that is intentionally in contrast to from the child's perspective of what they know is expected of them from their parent. All right, so those are two kinds. So the first kind that we're talking about, the childishness, a good mother or a good nurturer is patient with that, is understanding it. It's very frustrating, dads, for your wife to, or your wife who is a mom, to put up with a lot of childishness, especially with multiple children. That can get very frustrating very fast. And so it's you want to try to strengthen her and encourage her to be patient as a result of childish acts that happen. Now, conversely, all right, and this is the third thing if you're writing these down, the third thing that a good nurturer does is has zero tolerance for rebellious behavior. All right, and this is really important because we learn to respect authority when we're very young. Usually before we're 5 years old, we're learning to respect authority, and the nurturing person in our life has to teach us that. And that when we challenge the authority that is over us, then if we are not rebuked, that we come back to the old verse, spare the rod and spoil the child, then we do become spoiled. We fail to learn to respect the authority that's over us. And then when we become adults, we make poor choices and we don't realize the devastating consequences that those choices have, because there were no consequences when we were young, and therefore we end up in jail or addicted to drugs or all kinds of difficult problems in our life. And so it's so important that as nurturers, that women, that you are very stern and very rigid with acts of rebellion. And sometimes they're not even acts. It's an attitude. You kind of learn to, especially if you have teenagers, you kind of learn to have attitude radar. And they may be saying yes sir and yes ma'am and doing what was asked, but that that's all a facade, and deep down inside they're sharpening their knife or they're loading their gun with ammo in rebellion. And that's something that I think we can, as parents, develop a radar for to determine that, and then we have to correct that behavior, because what stirs up inside eventually comes out. And so we need to be very careful to be balanced with those things, because those can become blurred. And sometimes, if we're not really sensitive and committed as parents or as those that are nurturing, we can punish the childishness and let the rebellion go. And then we've really hurt our children in the long term, because we've not helped them understand what's right and what's wrong. We've not helped them understand how to live in society. And we're going to get to that in a little bit. We're going to talk about the design of the family and how important its role is in society. Because family is kind of like a pillar, and you have all these pillars that prop up society. All right? But if those pillars begin to break, then all of society collapses down. If you don't have a strong family sense of family in any culture, and you can look at this historically, that culture falls apart and breaks down. But we'll get to that in a minute. We're listing the characteristics of good nurturing for mothers. That was the third one. Now the fourth one is that moms and those that nurture can endure a lot of hardship. I was reminded of this when we went several weeks ago to Wilson's Creek, and we walked by the Ray House when we were hiking. And I am a little bit of a Civil War historian, and I think a lot about, I try to put myself in the perspective of the typical family. What would it have been like if I was a farmer and I was Farmer Ray, and I had this huge farm, and all of a sudden find myself in the middle of a battlefield. And I think about that wife, that mom, they're all, obviously, because we see the things in the home there, they had children, many children, I believe, if I remember correctly. And can you imagine what it would be like for her, the hardship she would have to endure? Not just from the normal sense of, cooking and, just simple things. Back then, I was sitting somewhere talking to somebody about the old stoves where they put the wood in, and you've got kind of a hot surface there, and you've got to spend time heating it up, and then you've got to make everything from scratch because there's no corner supermarkets where you go get stuff. Imagine that normal, difficult, challenging lifestyle as a mom, as a wife. And then compound that with the problems and difficulties of war. of soldiers coming in that are wounded and your crops being crushed. I mean, your ability to feed your family being in jeopardy. I mean, can you imagine the hardship that was endured for many moms, many women back during that time in the Civil War? And I use that example because I think now times we look at that and we think, wow, yeah, that would have been so hard. But yet, what I find is that in our culture, we have those same difficulties, those same battles, but they look different because our culture has changed. There are other stressors. Now they come from TV and from media, and they come from many women working hard in the workforce and needing to be nurturing and take care of their children, on top of maybe getting education, on top of taking care of parents that might be aging. I mean, we just pile those responsibilities on, and again, we find ourselves in the midst of hardship. And yet, one that nurtures well is patient with that, is able to endure that hardship with a good attitude and with a willingness to get up each and every day and go through that process over and over and over again to nurture those in their life that need nurturing. All right, and lastly, moms are self-sacrificing. And I want to look specifically at one particular mom, and her name is Jochebed, and she was the mother of, anybody know? Moses. Good. Yeah, a lot of times we don't hear her Hebrew name. She was the mother of Moses and Aaron and Miriam back in Exodus. So if you have your Bibles and want to follow the story with me, it's in Exodus chapter 2, beginning in verse 1. And let's read this story, and I want you to think about it. Oftentimes we read this story thinking about Moses and all the important things that he's going to do and how God called him to lead Israel out of captivity. But I want you to think about it for a moment as we read the story from Jochebed's position. What would it have been like for her to hide her infant? Because remember, the Pharaoh was trying to kill all the Hebrew babies to kind of cut their numbers down. And so she hid him for 3 months, and then she couldn't hide him anymore. And she was self-sacrificing. She loved her child enough that she was willing to give him up so that he could live, so that he would be all right, so that someone could take care of him. Beginning in verse 1. Now a man from the house of Levi went and married a Levite woman. And the woman conceived and bore a son. And when she saw that he was a fine baby, she hid him 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him. Papyrus is kind of like a thick paper-like substance. And placed it among the reeds on the bank of the river. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. The daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river. And while her attendants walked beside the river, she saw the basket among the reeds and sent her maid to bring it. When she opened it, she saw the child, and he was crying, and she took pity on him. This must be one of the Hebrews' children, she said. Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, Shall I go and get you a nurse from the Hebrew woman to nurse the child for you? Pharaoh's daughter said to her, Yes. So the girl went and called the child's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, Take this child and nurse it for me, and I will give you your wages. And so the woman took the child and nursed it. And when the child grew up, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and she took him as her son. And she named him Moses, because she said, I drew him out of the water. So Jochebed unselfishly gives up ownership, in a sense. I know we don't own our children, but it's important for a mom to feel like this is my child. But she gave that up because she loved him more than her emotional feelings, her emotional attachments to him, and was willing to give that up so that he could prosper in life. I mean, I guess beyond prosper, he could actually live, but then later on, of course, all this time goes by, years and years and years. For us, that passed in like 2 verses. But years and years and years went by, and Moses has grown up, and Pharaoh's daughter takes him into the royal family, into the noble family. And so I'm sure that was a very difficult thing for Jochebed to endure. And yet she did, because she was looking out for his best interest more than her own emotional attachment. And I find that in our culture, more and more as we become isolated and we become desperate to feel loved and to be loved, I find more and more that parents inappropriately draw emotional attachment from their children when it should be to their spouse. And we draw that maybe from our children. I think that happens because we are a nation of broken marriages. And we're not having the love that we need from our spouse, and therefore we try to get it from other places where it's not as healthy. And sometimes we try to take that from our children, where we ought to be loving them and putting their needs and what's best for them above of what they can do for us. Does that make sense? And I think that's a challenge for all of us as parents, because it causes us to be self-sacrificing. And that's an important value of a mother that nurtures well. So let's turn then and do talk about the design of the family and its value in our culture. You know, a lot of times we get into a battle, and anytime you talk about women as a preacher, you have to be very careful, because people can get, all up in arms about, women being in the workplace or not being in the workplace, and which is better, to be a stay-at-home mom or a working mom. And people can get really upset really fast. And so I think the part of the reason that that's such a problem and that's such a hot button in our culture is that we are focusing on the wrong thing. And we're focusing on equality and who's better or who's stronger or whatever, or who's the higher wage earner. Then we should be focusing on the value of the role of a mom and a dad in a family. And so that's what I'm going to do this morning, is to help us to maybe stop looking over here, because again, that's not an important conversation, but it's not as important as the conversation of the role. Think about it in the military, everything happens in units, all right? Whether you're in the Air Force, whether you're in the Army, whether you're in the Marines, the Navy, whatever, it all comes down to this unit or team of people that you serve with. And you don't ever see on the battlefield, you don't ever see all the team members run out in the battle and they start arguing about who's going to do what, and who's going to be, who's going to be the sniper, and who's going to rush the enemy, and who's going to, everybody, that's not an issue. What is an issue is the value of each person's role, right? Each person plays a valuable role in that team, and if one person fails, it lets the whole unit down. And so it's important that everyone understands their role. They're confident and I'm getting all worked up today with my allergies. That's confident and comfortable with that role, and they're ready to move forward and perform their duty to the best of their ability. And that's how the family ought to be. We ought to embrace our roles as the father, our roles as the mother, our role as the children, and we ought to work together as a unit and move forward to grow up, to work together, to better our family, to build things for our family, to learn, to teach those valuable things that should be passed down from one generation to the next. And then we should be able to operate in a way that's functional, and in a way where each person feels valued and feels confident in their role. And so I don't think I can put emphasis on this or stress this enough, because when we develop children into adults and they become the cultural architects of society, then all those things that we have invested in them and instilled in them, those things come to bear. And if we have confused them with what their role is, if we've confused them with who they are, with what their strengths and weaknesses are, and we've taught them the wrong things, then our society will fall apart. Our society will crumble from a lack of direction. Just like any military plan or military strategy, where everyone just decides that they're going to do their own thing, it always ends in chaos. It always ends in them losing the battle and fleeing or deserting and running away. Because we all have to work together. And so in the family, as we focus on the mom today, I think it's important that we zero in on the value of that role. And all of the important attributes and the important qualities and the way that we choose to be as moms, they all come from that primary role of being the one that nurtures, that one that instills those qualities that we talked about from before. If you have your Bibles, I want to read from Ephesians chapter 6, where it says, "Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother. This is the first commandment with the promise, that it may go well with you, and that you may live long in the land." And so right here we have a perfect picture of some of the roles in the family and why it's so important for children to honor their father and their mother. All right, now a lot of times I think we interpret that differently. We might say obey, we might use some other synonyms, but I think the most appropriate word there is honor. Because when you honor someone, basically you are instilling respect in them. All right, you are recognizing the value of their position, of their role. Okay, that doesn't mean you always agree with everything. It doesn't mean that everything they say or do is correct. But what it is, it's a recognition that you as the child, you value their role in the family, in the team, as a unit. And you act appropriately, fulfilling your role. You know, in our family, I think it's something that is very clear to our children. They understand that everyone in the family has a role. You know, and we have to, you know, when you have 7 people and 2 dogs living under one roof, and everyone's got activities, doing different things, and Stephanie and I have different responsibilities, it has to operate and function well, or there is total chaos. And if everyone just decides they're going to do their own thing, I mean, if there's a breakdown in communication between Stephanie and I, it is just chaos. It is chaos. So in order for us to function and fulfill the ministry that we have as a family, we all value our role. And each of our children has specific responsibilities that they know they have. Things they need to do around the house, things that they need to do. The older children know that it's their responsibility to mentor the young ones. And I constantly find David and Alicia and Michaela in many cases teaching the younger ones things. I didn't have to ask them to do that. I didn't have to say, go do, I mean, sometimes I do have to say that, but many times I will kind of walk by in a room and I'll listen and I'll hear things, and I realize and I rejoice in that one small thing that they have learned and understand that that is a role that they play as the older children. And so many times, not all the time, a lot of times we just fall apart and it's chaos, but many times we're able to move forward and accomplish things as a family because everyone knows their role and everyone respects the role of our parents. Then it helps us as we grow up to respect and understand God's role in our life as our authority, and the law and the judicial system and other authorities that are over us, that we are able to operate in society and in culture in a healthy way because we understand our role. See, all those things are tied together. They're all connected. And so when we are damaged, when we break down and we misunderstand what our role is, then there's confusion, there's chaos in society, and we see the effects of that as our prisons become overcrowded, as we see marriages and families breaking apart and falling apart. We see the consequences of that years later, but it all started very young whenever children were not nurtured the way that they need to be nurtured. So how do we honor our mothers? I think that's a question that tasks us today, and it is an important question. How do we honor them? First and foremost, I think by following Christ and living a life that is worthy of that calling. That honors our mother. That is a demonstration or a reflection of how she's leading us. And maybe for you came from a non-Christian home and that wasn't modeled for you. But yet, again, you are honoring the position. You're honoring the role. And so it's kind of like an unconditional role where you're going to perform your responsibility regardless of whether everyone else does or not. And that's hard to do. That's really hard. A lot of times, especially at work, we have the attitude, well, so-and-so didn't do what they were supposed to do, so I'm going to goof off too. I can remember very clearly a day that I have regretted for my whole life, and it probably doesn't really matter, but I recognize the value and the error of my way. I remember when I was 16 years old, I was working my first job I ever had. I had started as a busboy at Highland Springs Country Club in Springfield, and I'd kind of worked my way up to a waiter, and I was all excited, and just thought I was like, the ultimate guy, I think I was 17 by then, I was like, oh man, I'm making $5 an hour, I'm awesome, everything. And I remember one day, I was working with a friend, and we felt like we had been mistreated by the management. And this friend decided that he was just going to clock out and leave. That he was just going to, he was like, you know what, forget it. The management abused us, so we're just going to, and this was in the middle of a banquet. You know, there's a lot of stuff going on and everything. And I guess actually, now that I think about it, it was mostly done. I think there were 3 of us that were working it. And so he's like, I'm gone. And I bought into that. And I thought to myself, well, man, that guy, he didn't do what he was supposed to do, so I'm not either. So I clocked out and I left. Bam. Well, of course, my manager was not very happy with me the next day, and I pretty well thought I'm going to get fired after that because that's what I deserved for doing that. Now, fortunately, I was extended grace because I was a pretty good employee, and that didn't happen, and the management explained why they had made the decision that they did. But I think that picture of myself in my 17-year-old mind is a picture that many of us have in our families. You know, as children, we blame our parents and we say, oh, my dad didn't do this or my mom didn't this, therefore that gives me the right to do this and do whatever I want. Or as a parent, you say, well, you know, I just have bad children and blah, 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 so I'm just going to go and take a smoke break or whatever. You know, and we blame other people in our family unit for not performing their role, and then we feel like we're not responsible anymore to do our part. But we know that that's not true. We know that we need to perform our role in the family regardless of what everyone else does. And I think that as we get older and we see more and more the value of a healthy family, helps us to recognize how important it is for us to fulfill our role appropriately. Second thing that we can do to honor our mothers is to show them respect, to speak to them with respect. One of my great regrets is many times when I was a young man that I talked disrespectfully to my mother. And my dad was very good in this particular area, that he would always rebuke me. And I remember getting in a lot of trouble for talking disrespectfully to my mother. And so husbands, that is something that you need to do. You need to teach your children to respect their mother. Because you represent, and we'll talk about this as we get closer to Father's Day, you represent the strength and that firm hand, that act of decisiveness for children, both boys and girls, and you can teach them to respect their mother, to respect her role. Because the mother, by nature, is the nurturing person. And so while she can get pretty mad and mean and scary pretty fast, that's not her natural tendency, all right? Her natural tendency is to be that nurturer. And so a lot of times, husband, when you force your wife, when you don't back her up, you don't stand behind her, you force her to perform the wrong role. And then she becomes this mean, angry tyrant. My wife would never be like that. But she becomes this mean, angry tyrant and is ready to unleash hell's fury on the children. And it's because you put her in that position. And so we need to be careful to protect them in that role and to teach our children to respect them. Third, being patient with them and extending grace. You know, as a parent, one of the most humbling things for me is to realize and look at all the mistakes that I've made through the years, through 14 plus years of parenting. And as I begin to be on kind of that phase 2, you know, if there's phase 1 of parenting where there's more years ahead of parenting, I'm kind of excited to be in phase 2 where there's less years ahead. My oldest is not far away from graduating high school, and then my other kids are just right behind that. And so they're going to begin starting families of their own. You know, I wouldn't be surprised if I had grandchildren before the decade is out. No pressure on anybody. We've got some time for that to happen. But I can look back more than I can look ahead in wonder. I can look back and I can see all the decisions that I've made, and I regret that there have been mistakes that I've made. There have been times, like we talked about before, where I've punished childness and I've let rebellion go unchecked, and so on and so forth. And so as parents, we see that we make mistakes. And so we need to give our parents, and I wish I would have done this more as a child, given them a little bit of more grace, you know, and understood that it's hard to be a parent. It's very difficult. You've got so many things in life to balance and manage. And on top of that, all of those responsibilities, you have that role as a parent. And it's very hard. It's very difficult. But you know what? I will tell you this. It is one of the most, not if the most important role in society, period. And that's not to put down, you know, being the CEO of any country or being a missionary or any other great thing, you know, being Billy Graham. Those things are all important. But if you'll think back to our earlier part of the conversation, how we're nurtured, to a large extent, determines who we are or what difficulties in our life we have to overcome as we become adults. And so nurturing, parenting, is the premium responsibility, because if done right, we can be a blessing to our children and raise them to be godly adults. And I think that is important for you moms that are here today, in the audience today. Your number one role is a mom, all right? And listen, if you've kind of tuned out and you're playing on your phone and you're sending Facebook messages for just a moment, listen to me, all right, to this one thing. Your primary role as a mother is to cause, through your nurturing, your child to become a stable, independent adult. That's your goal. That's the ultimate goal, is you want not to push them out the door necessarily, but you want to teach them to live on their own, to make their own choices, to make wise choices, to be humble, patient, kind, gentle, joyful people. That is your goal. And so everything that you do as a mom, it should always be in support of that goal. And if you find yourself doing things that don't support that goal, then you've gotten off to the left or to the right. You need to get back on track, because that's the ultimate goal. And because if we can produce healthy people, then we're able to disciple and produce the believers that God has called us to produce as adults. And so that's so important for us today. We're about out of time. Let me give you this last thing. Number 4, how we honor our mothers. And this is really more to the husbands. And it's husbands, affirm your wife. Or maybe if it's grandparents, affirm your child, your daughter that is now a mom, or maybe soon to be a mom, or maybe she's 10 and you're preparing her and teaching her what it means to be a good mom. Because don't forget, as an aside, all of the things that we instill in our children when they're young, those things will come out when they're parents. I can promise you this. I can promise you this, that as you have been parented, so you will parent. And so it's really important that as you live your life, and it's not just what you say, it's how you live, you are teaching, by your parenting, your children how to parent. And those things can go on for hundreds of years in families, for the good and for the bad. And so it is so important, it is crucial, not only to your family, but to our culture as Christian people, to the building blocks of society, that we get this right and that we fulfill our role properly. Let's take some time and pray about this. Lord, I thank you that you have designed things in such a way that it's not unclear, it's not necessarily confusing, that we can know through your word and through the way that you have taught us to live how we are to act as children, as fathers, as mothers, as grandparents, as sisters, as brothers. Lord, I'm thinking of those that are here that don't have children, maybe that are older adults that don't have children, but yet they have the role as a nurturer in so many ways. So Lord, we don't focus on the traditional sense necessarily of mother and father, but we recognize that we're all mothers, that we're all fathers in some sense, because there are people in our lives that need to be nurtured. And we need godly women to come alongside them and to adopt them, to take care of them. I think we have some biological mothers and fathers that probably need to adopt their own biological children and realize, man, I've walked away from my responsibility and I need to get back and I need to focus on it. And I need to invest the time that it's needed. And God, I pray that as I say these things and as we seek you together as a group this morning, that you would move in our hearts, first to develop compassion, that we would love those younger people. Maybe we're in our 60s or 70s or 80s and we're looking at those that are in their 40s, those that are 50s, that have older children that need to be encouraged, that need to be supported as they waver in their role as a parent, Lord. Maybe we're young parents, we just have a newborn child or very young children and we're still learning in our role as parents and trying to understand what it means to be a good parent, Lord. Lord, you know that they need to be encouraged as well. Lord, for the kids that are here today, Lord, I pray that you would encourage them to honor their father and their mother. To recognize that the implications of doing that go far beyond the simple request to pick up a shirt or to go and accomplish a certain task. And Lord, I pray most of all today that you would just bless those nurturers that are here today, those nurturers in our community, everywhere, God, that we would honor you as our Creator, as our designer, by fulfilling our role in the appropriate way. And God, we just take all of these things, we bring them to the foot of the cross, we bring them into your presence, God, that your light would shine on us and teach us to be the people that we ought to be. And we just thank you for this, Lord, and we ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.